Okay, we are recording. Good morning, everyone. This is Peter Smallage. I welcome you, either welcome you back or welcome you anew to the monthly Forest Connect webinar series. We're in April 15th in the midst of COVID-19. I hope you all are well and will remain well. So these are strange times for everyone. But we are, as we often are, joined today by a great speaker who's got a great topic. And we have about just shy of 300 people registered as of 5 minutes ago, which speaks to the offering. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you all Jenny Wightman. I've known and interacted with Jenny on a variety of projects over the years. We just got word we're going to be starting a new project together, so that's going to be exciting. Today, though, she's going to be speaking about forest ecosystem services. So with that, I'm going to mute my microphone, and Jenny, it's all yours.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everybody. This is just amazing. I can't believe there's now 194 on here. But so today I'm going to talk about forest ecosystem services, a project that I was doing with Peter Woodbury at Cornell University, or I've been doing with Peter. I just want to start by telling you who I am. I think we all need to evaluate the subjectivity of each other, and often when you present, you don't give your background. And of course, this is my idea of my background, so again, it's still imperfect. But I like to do this in order for you to recognize my biases in my presentation. I've been researching at Cornell for over 20 years, primarily focused on greenhouse gas mitigation from agriculture, forestry, and energy systems. I grew up in rural New Hampshire, where we had more cows than people, but my home now is in New York City, radically different. My parents were old school conservatives, and that meant you conserved resources to conserve money. I thought my parents were environmentalists, and so it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I realized there are very different ways of being environmental. My dad was a carpenter, and we used 3 wood stoves to heat our house. My brothers chopped cords and cords and cords of wood. I never had to, but I had to bring it in. I love the smell of wet wood and dry wood. I love the grains and characters of different woods, and I adore hiking in woods. So what that means is I'm still a romantic about woods. I worry about making woods into an industrial complex of only providing goods. But I also think our forests are amazing, complex ecosystems that are invaluable. And so here I am giving a talk on the merits of forests to people who probably know a ton more about how forests actually work, but I'm going to talk more conceptually. First, I just want to set up a basic idea about how working lands provide diverse benefits. And what do I mean by working lands? Well, I mean agriculture, forests, and waterways. And what do I mean by diverse benefits? These working lands provide many ecosystem services, including saleable products like corn, timber, and hydroelectricity, landscapes for living, for recreation and wildlife habitat, and services like clean water, clean air, and climate regulation. There are different definitions. There's more than this. I just collected these as a range of what is an ecosystem service. It reflects the interdependencies between society and nature. Another definition is ecological characteristics, functions, or processes that directly or indirectly contribute to human well-being, and the effects on human well-being of the flow of benefits from an ecosystem endpoint to a human endpoint at a given extent of space and time. So here's one of the first biases, in my opinion, on ecosystem services, is that it's very human-centric. It's thinking about benefits or flows for human purpose. So most people are familiar with products from a forest, but ecosystem services are intended, in my opinion, to increase knowledge about the services associated with a forest. Both of them, of course, are very important services from a forest, but I'm just making a distinction here in order to help us think more critically about the services they provide. So examples of ecosystem products: wood harvested and processed for paper products, for long-lived building materials, for bioenergy. And then this employs foresters, loggers, truckers, plant processing employees, etc. Right? There's clear economic measures coming from this forest system. But meanwhile, those same forests are functioning as major water filtration plants, improving air quality, sequestering carbon, providing habitat for wildlife, providing food from hunting, providing joy and reprieve from hiking. And so when you're analyzing ecosystem services, people have begun thinking in categories of provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. So an example of provisioning is supplying raw materials, meaning wood products. Regulating would be filtering air and water, so that is improving drinking water. Cultural, which is experiential, something like hiking, which is not monetized, but ecotourism, which may be monetized. And supporting, which is habitat creation so that you have diverse species and robust ecological systems that are cycling. But the context of this value comes down to valuation, comes down to sort of 4 ways of thinking about it. The location of where the service or disservice is happening, the demand for the service or disservice, the cost to implement, and the capacity to pay. I personally do not believe in win-win situations. Win-win is only effective within certain boundaries. And ultimately, there is a subjectivity evaluation, who's winning, and because there's always trade-offs for every decision we make. So for example, not only do we need to think about ecosystem services, but we need to think about ecosystem disservices. And this is what I'm trying to point out about the subjectivity here. So for urban trees, some people really advocate for them because they increase shade and reduce heat island effect, which reduces electricity costs, which has, of course, impacts on climate change. It improves air quality, increases property values. But some people fear that trees cause more vermin because there's more creatures that can live in them, increased crime because people can hide behind them, increased insurance claims for fallen limbs on very expensive cars. So you can see how certain people want these services and certain people don't want these services, and this affects how we make decisions. So here are the definitions again, and I am just using this just to remind us about the interdependencies, characteristics, functions, or processes, and then the flows of benefits from an ecosystem to a human endpoint. And the reason I refresh us on that is because there are different categories of beneficiaries from these ecosystem services. So on the far left here, I have different kinds of land managers, people who are actively engaging the land. So there are the direct people, like the farmers and the landowners. Then there are the soil and water conservation districts and the cooperative extension agents that are working with these landowners. Then there are foresters and loggers who are also working with these landowners and doing work. And then there's state officials or state-sponsored organizations like New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and the Forest Service that provide resources and leadership on how we might manage the land. And then, of course, there are the legislators who are instigating policies that force land management strategies. But then there's a whole bunch of possible beneficiaries. You could have the landowners themselves, which is a local benefit, and the improved forest management increases their forest profitability, right? So they're self-interested individuals. But then there are also consumers. There are the consumers locally who might purchase or buy the product, or if the product is moved globally around the world, then your consumer who's benefiting from your acre of land in New York State could be in Brazil. Then there's people who visit the land who is a beneficiary, and they benefit from the experiences of visiting that land, which is generally local or regional. You could consider upstream polluters as potential beneficiaries, because if the forest can sequester and filter various pollutants, then that issue is being addressed. But you could also consider downstream users, which could be local, regional, or global, who benefit because the forest clean, say local drinking water, or reduce or sequester carbon in the forest, which affects global citizens for mitigating climate change. And then government, you could think about as a beneficiary, meaning in terms of maintaining ecosystems, not just for current generations, but for future generations. So the scope of an ecosystem service benefit could be someone who is not yet born. So how do we encourage payment for ecosystem services? Here is one definition that I like for the payment of ecosystem services: formal and/or informal contracts in which a landowner is remunerated for managing their land to produce one or more ecosystem services, and it involves a payment between at least one willing buyer and one willing seller to produce or enhance a well-defined ecosystem service or bundle of services. So how could we negotiate how these payments are made? Well, we could have public payments, federal, state, and local governments to landowners for afforestation to enhance ecosystem services. Or we could have voluntary transactions like purchase of hunting permits or conservation easements. Or we could have something like compliance driven, like the cap and trade program through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, where the electric sector is regulated to reduce the greenhouse gases, and then they pay for reforestation projects to offset or mitigate some fraction of their emission regulations. So what are we paying for? Are we paying for an individual good or service, or are we paying for bundled services? So here's one example: biomass for electricity. You have your explicit payment being paid by your electric user. The value of the wood harvest would be paid to the landowner, forester, logger, and the electric plant by those that purchase the electricity made from that biomass. But are there other services that come from that forest land besides electricity generation? Of course there are. But there are limited financial rewards and/or penalties to support the positive or address the negative impacts to that ecosystem, such as water quality, wildlife habitat, and future forest growth. Here's another example using corn grain. Let's imagine two farmers, each with 100 acres of corn. They each produce 160 bushels of corn per acre. However, one farmer grows a winter cover crop and has a riparian buffer to reduce erosion and nutrient runoff. Currently, the market pays these farmers the same amount for growing the same amount of corn. However, one farmer is providing better water quality to those downstreams. Payments for ecosystem services is one possible mechanism for rewarding a landowner for good practices. So what I think is kind of a turning point is payment for ecosystem services provides a kind of a carrot mechanism rather than a stick mechanism. We've had a lot of policies around a polluter pays kind of system, where government regulations set limits on how much pollution can be emitted, resulting in penalties for those that are not in compliance. So what this does is it penalizes bad behavior. Money paid for non-compliance is internalized by the producer and encourages producers to spend money to comply, therefore to avoid the non-compliance fees or penalties. In contrast, payment for ecosystem services is when the beneficiaries pay. They pay for the benefits they receive from good land management. So in other words, this is rewarding good behavior. Money paid is externalized to downstream beneficiaries who may or may not consume these products' activities directly or indirectly provided by the ecosystem. So again, coming back to this idea of both goods and services from the same landscape, consumers generally pay for goods and not for services. While products can be sold locally or globally, most services tend to be local. In other words, impacts to watershed by water quality. So in other words, a poorly managed farm might cause more erosion and nutrient release to the watershed, negatively impacting the watershed. Some of the services are global, such as the carbon sequestration and forest stock that has impact globally. My point here is that location matters. I'm going to now talk about the urban-rural poster child of payment of ecosystem services with a focus on New York City's watershed. So some context. In 1989, the federal EPA put forward a Safe Drinking Water Act requiring filtration of surface water. New York City drinking water relies on 19 watersheds and it's unfiltered public drinking water. It is called the champagne of drinking water. It services 8 million people in New York City and 1 million in Putnam, Orange, Ulster, and Westchester counties. As a result of this legislation at the federal level, New York City considered two options. Option one was to build a 6 to 10 billion water treatment plant with a $1 million per day operating cost. Option two was to improve upstate land management to reduce sediments and nutrients so that it could continue to be an unfiltered public drinking water system. So the Safe Drinking Water Act came out in 1989. By 1993, New York City submitted a long-term watershed protection and filtration avoidance program. And the proposal was $1.5 billion to be spent over 10 years, accrued from New York City taxes. A memorandum of agreement was made in 1997 between New York State, New York City, and the specific counties, with New York State DEC to implement the watershed protection program to avoid the filtration plant. This has gone through every 5 years, this is brought back up, and this has continued today, and the last time it was renewed was in 2017. So, what are the drivers? Well, New York City is regulated by a federal government to ensure clean drinking water to its residents. New York City is dense, so it's easier to amass funds for a specific initiative. And so when it amasses those funds, it either buys property or pays upstate New York managers to reduce contaminants in the New York State area that affects the New York City watershed. The benefits from going in this direction is increased recreation land for upstate for all people, rural economic development, and a reduced price for New York City drinking water. So We have several watersheds, 19 different reservoirs. And what you see here is how some of the money is being funneled through the Watershed Agricultural Council. Oh gosh, it says my internet connection is unstable. Can everybody hear me? Peter, can you just check in?
Yep, you're good. Every once in a while you get a little,
Warbly?
yeah, that's warbly. Okay, but it's good. You're good. Keep
Okay.
going. Keep going.
So some of the money that New York City has funneled through New York State DEC is then funneled to the Watershed Agricultural Council, which focuses on the reservoirs to the west of the Hudson River. And I'm just pointing out some of, this is what they publish as their program footprints. Yellow dots are for the easement program. The blue dots are for the agricultural program, and they're all out here on the west. I didn't include them, in part because I was focusing on forestry. And the green dots are forest initiatives that are both in the watershed and downstate. So my point here is this is how some of the money from New York City is being funneled into payments for ecosystem services upstate. To note, so let me just go back. So over here, the Croton watershed is one of New York City's oldest watersheds. And it's considered less high quality. And I mean, it's still good. Nobody should be at all concerned. And so recently, New York City built a small water treatment plant in the Bronx to clean the Croton Reservoir sources for New York City. One of the interesting things about installing a water treatment plant is that if there's too much phosphorus, you can create toxic byproducts. And so while historic payments for ecosystem services upstate New York in the Croton watershed targeted both nitrogen and phosphorus nutrients, now the payments for ecosystem services are focused primarily on phosphorus and not so much on nitrogen. And so the point here is that ecosystem services are socially driven. While managing and in the watershed is still a good idea, it's no longer a priority of being funded by the New York City water system. So what do we know? We know that regulations matter. So clean drinking water drove upstate management. We also know creative problem solving is key, choosing farms over processing plants. We know context matters. Dense New York City has the collective income to pay for these ecosystem services. Location matters. If Brazil buys our grain because it is cheaper, do they care what happens to our drinking water? I keep picking on Brazil. I don't know why I'm choosing Brazil, but the point is, if market forces make our grain cheaper because we aren't taking care of our watershed, when you purchase it outside of our watershed, does the buyer really care? And then policies matter. If milk prices are regulated, do farmers have the surplus income to make the water quality improvement measurements on their own? But mostly it's fuzzy. Should New York State regulate actors in the watershed so everyone has clean drinking water? Is it fair that New York City could make a land grab of rural lands to protect its drinking water for millions of people? Is it an honor or a burden to be a good steward? Is it an honor or a burden to be a landowner? And then taking it in a different direction, does New York City provide different kinds of services to the rest of the state by being densely populated? Should upstate New York pay New York City for the reduced per capita greenhouse gas emissions? And what is this value? Is it valued temporally for current populations, or is it valued for future generations? Is this value is only for humans or for other species? Is this value locally recognized or globally recognized? And is this value fungible or substitutable? So there are these different ways of coming up for these valuation methods. So shared value, 1 ton of CO2 mitigated in New York State is equal to 1 ton of CO2 mitigated in Brazil. Substitutable, New York City water treatment plant could cost $6 billion, which is less than New York State land management for ecosystem services upstate, which in the beginning were $150 million per year, much less than the $6 billion water treatment plant with a $1 million a day cost for making the plant run. Markets, explicit prices paid. Wood pellets shipped to Europe for heating versus wood pellets sold in New York State. Preferences, and I put a question mark here because it's the best word I have for it at this time, but it's these implied preferences for a value. So someone pays for a fishing license, someone pays in an ecotourism event. People are hiking on public trails, indicating that they like public monies spent to maintain those trails. The continuation of having a forest service. And then there's another one, which is something more defensive, which is where you purchase land, for example, to reduce flooding and associated costs for rebuilding. So you could plant trees there instead. So we gathered some data. And so while there have been historic ways we've been supporting forest ecosystem services, funding the US Forest Service and the Department of Environmental Conservation, certifying wood products for sustainable harvest, the New York State Environmental Protection Fund for the Open Space Program, acid rain reductions in the Midwest industries helping Northeast forests not be impacted by acid rain, conservation easements, tax breaks, national and state parks. Some researchers have also been coming up with various valuations for a hectare of forest land. And these were collected for temperate forests with a focus on sort of Northeast USA and Canada. So various researchers found bundled benefits from a hectare ranging from 3,500 to over 16,000. Fresh water was valued from $230 to $994 per hectare. Air quality, $9 to $9,000 per hectare. Now, what I want to point out, for example, with air quality is $9 is really a rural price for air quality, and $9,000 has to do with air quality in urban areas. So again, this is indicating location and demand by a population. Energy conservation, $242 to $485. Ecotourism from $1 to $1,200. Climate regulation from $184 to $1,600. Soil health from $6 to $113 per hectare per year. I'm curious how many people out there are wanting to bundle all of these wonderful benefits we've taken for granted, or maybe we haven't taken for granted from our forest ecosystems. So I just want to shift into a forthcoming ecosystem service as a response to climate change. So forests have an incredible capacity for carbon sequestration and the production of long-lived wood products that continue to sequester carbon 100 years into the future in homes and in furniture. And in this context, New York State has some pretty admirable and serious mitigation goals of a GHG reduction of 40% of 1990 levels by 2030. That's 10 years from now. I don't mean to state the obvious, but I just want to pause on the significance of this and honor the goal, and that we would have an 85% reduction by 2050. Forests provide a very great ecosystem service for assisting in this goal. And New York State is currently 60% forested. Now, I always feel required to show this slide in almost every talk I give, regardless of the subject matter. So this is United States energy consumption from the 1700s, late 1700s to now. And you'll see that wood peaked around 1875 and started going down when we started finding fossil fuels and using fossil fuels. And you'll see that our energy consumption in 1875 cumulatively was just maybe 5 quadrillion BTU. And on the right-hand side, you have to get the gravity of how much fossil fuels that we are using, you have to add all of these things up. So right now it's showing petroleum as 35 quadrillion BTU, but we need to add to that the 25 quadrillion BTU from natural gas and the 20 quadrillion BTU from wood, and it's way up here at the top. And so all I'm trying to get at is around the 1900s, New York State was considerably less forested than we are now. And in fact, the fact that we have this much forest currently is a function of our transition from that renewable resource to these fossil-based resources. So in the context of meeting these New York State greenhouse gas mitigation goals, in the 2020, there are several new supports for ecosystem services for forests. There's been an ongoing program called Trees for Tributary Programs, organized by the DEC for planting trees and shrubs along streams to create riparian buffer strips. In the 2020 New York State Bond Act, there's conservation corridors to restore critical habitats for fish and wildlife. Capital projects that preserve, enhance, and restore New York's natural resource and reduce impacts of climate change. This was a little bit vague. And then $1 million to the State University of New York College ESF, SUNY ESF, for its climate applied forestry research institutes to support research and development of forestry and forest products. So these are things coming forward into the current budget. So arguments for supporting more ecosystem services: make the land more valuable than selling it for development, optimizing the overall productivity of forest, not just the sale of wood products, and improving management, thus improving carbon sequestration, as well as increasing harvest of sales. So people have different positions on whether or not we should support payment for ecosystem services. Some pros are improved protection of nature, improved well-being of society, and supporting best management practices. Cons is the notion of commodifying of nature. It may reflect bias by policy levers, but frankly, everything reflects bias. That it's based on a human-centric evaluation, and it's driven by beneficiaries, which have subjective value positions. So where do ecosystem services lead us? I am winding down and bringing us into an area of opinion. It allows us to start thinking systems wide about how our local and global ecosystems interact, such as connecting forests that might be hundreds of miles away to our drinking water, or connecting forests in New York State to the climate mitigation value to people who live in Bangladesh in extreme flood areas. Ecosystems require time and space to filter, cycle, and grow. So ecosystem services allow us to think more spatially and temporally about why we value forests, and recognizing the multiple services change the way we think about what working lands are actually doing. So in contrast to the visible pollution in the 1960s that led to the regulation of polluters, like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, because lakes and rivers were actually on fire, and that was incongruent with common sense. Ecosystem service thinking leads us to an appreciation of the regenerative capacity of our shared ecosystems, so that perhaps we find ways to value them. So the point being is, let's value them. They're amazing. And I'll just sort of put in a poem, because forests, of course, provide a lot more than water filtration and wood products. Thank you. I'm going to stop my screen share so that I can see questions.
Jenny, that was great. Thank you. I appreciate the presentation. And it was, I know that I'll cast myself as guilty of being kind of a lumper and thinking about ecosystem services. And so this was helpful to, to share a perspective of how to isolate different parts of ecosystem services and how they're connected across different geographies and through time and space. So that was good. And there has been a great deal of chatter in the chat window. Jenny, can you see the questions? Is it easier for you?
So I had to remove my screen share in order to see questions, and I apologize because while I'm presenting, I can't see the questions.
That's okay. That's all right. Can you see them now? Do you want me to read them to you, or do you want to read
yes.
through them? Or?
Why don't you direct me, because you've probably been tracking, you know, and you can synthesize similar questions.
Okay. All right. So go back
and use the timestamp, maybe. Oh gosh,
yep.
No, use the name and the timestamp.
Okay. So Norman at 12:18 was the first question. Okay. So he was wanting to know where the money's going to come to pay for these.
Of course.
And it's, you know, it looks good on paper, but how does it play out in reality? And I think you got into that a little bit, but maybe you want to just speak to the question that would come up, is like, who's going to pay for it and how are they going to pay for it?
Yeah. I'm just going to try to stay as unbiased as possible in this. I guess one of the things I didn't really discuss in this was the idea of precedence. So, you know, when there's been until we started consuming and polluting so much, the precedent was the ecosystems were providing all of these benefits like clean drinking water to humans and non-humans alike. And I guess while it was easy in the 60s to identify point sources of pollution like dirty smoke coming out of a smokestack and dirty water coming out of a wastewater treatment plant, that we could easily identify sources of massive pollution, and those happen to be associated with financially operating systems, and then the regulations could be internalized into those financial systems. I personally am skeptical that we should pay for good behavior. I think there is a certain amount of honor and responsibility for owning land. But that being said, we all need to be nudged and helped to think about things differently. So to answer your specific question, where does this money come from? It comes from this recognition of valuation. So the fact that New York State is beginning to value climate mitigation. The Bond Act is about sequestration over a 30-year time period over the next 30 years, right? So that money fundamentally comes from taxes. I don't know. This is how we have to think about it. Do we penalize the polluter, or do we reward the good manager? And I think that's sort of the and do we only value discrete products like a ream of paper or a cord of wood, or do we value indirect things like water quality and hiking? And if those processes are difficult to give financial value, how do we find ways to support that? So I don't know, Norman, I'm sorry. I feel like I'm not really answering that. I hope the example of the New York City watershed gives one framework if we decide to go in that direction.
Okay, and I'm not going to read through all the assorted comments, Jenny. I'll save the chat and send that to you so you can read through it. But I'll just focus on the questions. So the next question by Brendan at 1234. He's noting that some of the things that you've identified as ecosystem services are not things that he would have typically thought of. And as an example, he said he's trying to get his head around recreation as an example of an ecosystem service. So are there, maybe you can just broadly describe how does one think about or define in general terms those services, for lack of a better word, those services, entities that are considered an ecosystem service? I mean, at what point does something become an ecosystem service versus not an ecosystem service?
So one thing is if a hiking trail costs money to enter, so that would be an explicit payment, and then you could have people who volunteer to maintain the trails, and then you could have people who are paid by the state to cut out trees along the trails that have blocked the trails as a kind of payment for maintaining those ecosystems. Then I think also New York State, for example, in the New York City watershed has, even though it purchased certain acres in order to protect water quality, it chose to open up those acres so that people could use them. And while that would be considered a co-benefit from the primary goal, which is water protection, but nonetheless, the hiking functions as something that people gain from. They get exercise, they get fresh air, they clear their head, they have somewhere to go when COVID-19 happens, right? Like, again, ecosystem services are all about how does one choose to value natural resources. And Whether or not we pay for them is another matter, but whether or not we gain from them, I think is clear. I think forests as recreation is a public good. I don't know, did I not answer that directly?
I think you did.
Okay.
So, and I wasn't just, so you know, as you're answering, I'm looking for the next question. So I'm not,
Okay.
I'm not entirely zeroed in on your response, but that, so what I heard was sounded good. So Guy wants to know if tropical rainforests sequester more carbon per acre than northern forests or northeastern forests. Do you know those numbers or general relationships? Or is it does it depend on too many different things to be able to make a general statement? So tropical forest sequestration versus northern forest, northeast forest sequestration.
Um, I I can't answer that in an authoritative way.
Okay.
I will just say that in general, a healthy growing ecosystem is going to sequester as much carbon as it can, and because it just behooves it. And so I usually think of an acre as being an acre as being an acre, but then how we treat it, right? If we grow an acre of corn, we get tons of corn grain and a bunch of corn stover, and we get a bunch of carbon in the soil, but we eat up the corn, we feed the stover to cows, and then all the microbes break down all of the carbon in the soil in order to feed the next generation of corn. So a cornfield is going to cycle the carbon on an annual basis, where a forest system is going to have a much longer carbon sequestration and then return cycle back to the atmosphere. So I think it has more to do with thinking about what it is you are asking an acre of land to do, and how to optimize that acre of land to do those things with the most ecosystem services and the least ecosystem disservices. Does that make sense? Like, yeah.
Okay. So I'm not sure how to handle, there are lots of points that people are offering, which are all very interesting. It's a little, I think they're all submitted to panelists and attendees, so I will let everyone read them for themselves rather than me reading them out loud, just in the interest of time. So Brendan wanted to know about did you discuss the increase in forest land and what prompted that increase in forest land, Jenny?
I know. So imagine in the 1900s we didn't have, or the 1800s we didn't have fossil fuels yet. We needed acres of land to grow hay in order to feed our transportation system of horses. We needed acres of land to produce our food, and we needed acres of forest land to build our boats and build our homes and heat our homes. And so the deforestation that happened prior to the discovery of fossil fuels was because we were using that land in various ways. When fossil fuels came around, we no longer needed them so much to heat our homes, though of course a certain fraction of society heats their homes with wood. The discovery of steel and concrete as building materials reduced the demand for wood as a building material. And fossil fuels running cars as opposed to hay feeding horses for transportation sort of afforded that increase of forest in the state. So, I mean, now we laud it as a major carbon sink, but we have to recognize that over 100 years ago, most of it was deforested. And then, you know, we could have whole discussions about the quality of our current forest, but the point is not much of our forest is old growth in the state.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that's all the questions that I am seeing. So there are some people ask. So there's a. Let me type in. Your email is what? Jennifer.Wightman.
JW93.
Okay, JW. I'm sorry. Do it again. JW.
JW93.
93 at Cornell. And then you had a blog site.
Yep, it is blogs.cornell.edu/Woodbury, WOODBURY.
All right, so those are up there for people who want to check those out. So I will call the webinar to a close. I want to thank Jenny again for a great presentation, and I especially want to thank all of the participants who had the energy and the attention and the just the motivation. It was very engaging to have everybody participating in this. So, and we topped out. If
One
you're
last comment.
Oh, sure.
I just saw Richard Carbonetti's comment. If we paid the true cost of fossil fuels and the impacts on the environment and tax those negative impacts, there would be revenue to pay for sustainable ecosystem services. Right? Like, yeah.
Yep.
I agree, Richard.
Okay, and just for your records, we topped out at 244 people. So that's great.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. Jenny will be back at 7 o'clock if you want to see this again.